Hi, welcome here. I'm Marissa and I love sourdough. So if you stumbled upon this video and you're wanting to get started with sourdough, or maybe you have been baking with sourdough for a while but you feel like it's just a little bit complicated and you would like a simpler way, then keep watching because I'm going to share all of my tips to help you get started really enjoying sourdough, to not feel overwhelmed with it, and to be able to fit it into a busy life in the easiest way. Let's first talk about sourdough starters and how you can get started with one. So you can absolutely start off with sourdough, making your own starter from scratch. That's absolutely a way to go. But if you want to skip kind of the hassle, all the steps and process that it can take to get a brand new, newly created starter robust and strong enough and working well, just go find somebody who has a well-established starter and ask them for a little bit so that you can feed it and have it for your own. Some places that you can look for a well-established sourdough starter could be an artisan bakery that's in your area. You can kind of look around, do some research, and find a good bakery that makes real long fermented sourdough bread. Oftentimes they will either sell you a little bit of sourdough or be happy to give some away. Or if you have a friend who is already making sourdough, you could ask them for a little bit of their starter. As you know, you have to discard sourdough every time you feed it. And so people who are baking on a regular basis will oftentimes be glad to give you a little bit. And you don't need much to start your own starter. So you could ask around if you know somebody. Other options would be to look on Facebook or local meetups, somewhere online where you can meet like-minded people who are wanting to bake with sourdough or are already experienced. You can kind of meet a group of people, share tips, and get some starter that way. If you can start baking with an already well-established starter, you'll just have success that much quicker. You'll skip a lot of the learning curve for trying to get a starter going in the first place. So that's my first tip. My second tip is don't get worried about all the science and all the scientific stuff and the measurements and the ratios and all of that kind of thing. If you want to later on, that can be really fun to explore and experiment with. But when you're first getting started, worrying too much about all the science will just get you overwhelmed and might make it not as enjoyable as it could be. So I highly recommend just not worrying about that. When people are just starting, what I like to recommend is to just follow this basic rule of thumb for feeding your sourdough starter. And that is start with a little bit of starter, add equal parts flour and water until it looks like a thick pancake batter. Mix it really well, and you should be good to go. So that will give you what is known as a 100% hydration sourdough starter. So if you're following a recipe and it says you need a 100% hydration sourdough starter, don't freak out. Don't worry about, what does that mean? How do I know what hydration it is? If it's a nice thick pancake batter and you've used equal parts flour and water, then chances are it's a 100% hydration sourdough starter and it will work just fine for that recipe. So don't worry about that, about all the science and the ratios and the measurements and all of that. When you're first starting to feed your starter, if you want to, you can follow a simple ratio for feeding it, some simple measurements, and that is grab your scale, make sure that you have 20 grams of leftover sourdough starter discard, add to it 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. And sometimes it can be helpful just to grab your scale and measure those out for the first few feedings, just so that you can have a good feel for what that actually looks like. And then after that, if you just kind of remember what that looked like and go for that nice thick pancake batter consistency, then you should be just fine. And then, like I said later, if you want to experiment with different hydration, having a runnier sourdough starter or something like that, you can absolutely do that when it feels fun. But if worrying about any of the science stuff just feels too hard and too much and overwhelming, don't worry about it. You can absolutely have great success baking with sourdough, not even worrying about that. My next tip for having success with sourdough while keeping it nice and easy and doable and not overwhelming is go ahead and use a scale. So don't let this scare you off. I know for me, I didn't do this for a while in the beginning, and it was really silly looking back, because when you use a scale, not only do you get a lot more accurate measurements for your baking and your recipes, using a scale actually does make it a lot easier. You have one bowl and you add your ingredients into your bowl on your scale, and so it saves you a lot of dirty dishes. You don't have all the same measuring cups and measuring pitchers to measure out cups and tablespoons and different things and add them to your bowl. You just add them straight into your main mixing bowl and then watch the scale to see how much of that thing you need to add. So go ahead and just, even if you're just starting out and you feel like, oh, I can get by without a scale, I'll just measure, just trust me, it makes it actually way easier just to use a scale. And then, like I said, you also get more consistent, good results because your measurements are so much more accurate that way. Another tip I have is don't try to get too fancy and too wild with your recipes too soon. And what I mean by this is trying anything too complicated, adding a bunch of extra mix-ins, things like that. I mean, I'm not going to dissuade anybody from being creative and branching out for sure. So when you feel ready and you're ready to experiment, then that can be really, really fun. But when you're just getting started, stick to some more basic, tried and true recipes that turn out well easily, and you'll just be a lot more motivated to stick with it because you'll be making delicious homemade sourdough baked goods right away instead of dealing with frustrating things that didn't turn out the way that you hoped that they would. So in this video, I am making our kind of standard weekly sourdough bake that I like to do on a very regular basis, and that is some bread. I will do sourdough sandwich bread or the round loaves with the cut patterns on top. This time I'm doing a sourdough sandwich loaf, and we've really been loving this one. I'll put the recipe down in the description box down below, but that is definitely one that's very easy for beginners to start with, and I would highly recommend that as one that you can start with. If you've been on my channel before and you've seen the other round loaves with the fancy little cut designs in the top, that's another one that can work really well for beginners, and I will have that linked down in the description box as well. Either of those are great bread recipes to start with. The other things that I'm making today are some hamburger buns. We like to make those homemade on a weekly basis and eat homemade burgers with those every week. I'll put the recipe, it's actually my recipe, down in the description box below, and you can check that one out. That's another really simple one that turns out great easily. And then the other thing that I'm making today is sourdough pizza dough. And this one is really great because you don't need active sourdough starter for it. You just need sourdough discard. And it's, again, so easy. It really couldn't be easier. You just toss everything together in the bowl, you let it sit overnight, and then you stick it in the refrigerator until you're ready to bake with it, if you want to. You can also bake with it right away once it's done rising. Or you can just stick it in the refrigerator and let it sit there for, up to 2 or 3 days, honestly, until you're ready to make your pizzas. So again, so easy, great use for sourdough discard, and who doesn't love homemade pizza, right? It's one of my favorite easy dinners that my kids always love and are always so excited to have. Lately, we've actually been having it on a weekly basis since I can easily just whip up some of the dough along with my other sourdough things that I'm making for the week. Another thing that can be great to make when you're just getting started with sourdough are the other types of sourdough discard recipes like waffles, pancakes, crepes, all those different kinds of things. And I actually have a blog post on my website that is a whole bunch of different recipes that you can make with sourdough starter discard. And I'll have that link down below as well. But that can be really fun to look through and just get ideas, because when you're feeding your sourdough starter all the time, you do have discard that you need to use at different times. And I know for me personally, I don't like seeing anything go to waste, so I pretty much always find a way to use that sourdough discard. So lately it's been recipes like I talked about, pancakes, waffles, crepes, things like that, or I will do the pizza dough with my discard. But some other ways that I've found in the past that are really fun are other ways that you can kind of add it to recipes. So cookies are another one that you can do. You can mix up cookies. If you've been on my channel for a while, you've seen me make chocolate chip cookies with sourdough. So you just add some of it to your cookie recipe, and then you can let the batter sit on the counter for a while, or you can let it sit in the refrigerator for a couple days, whatever kind of works with your schedule. But that's a great way to use up sourdough discard. You can also use it as kind of a thickener if you're making sauces and gravies and different things like that. And I know for me, I always like when I'm making anything with flour to have it fermented for those great benefits of easier digestibility and unlocked nutrients. It's just really nice to kind of stick to that rule of thumb. I mean, not hard and fast or anything, but in general, the more that I stick to that, I know the better I feel. So it's kind of nice because if you were making like a gravy or a sauce or something, and normally you would just add like some regular flour that's not been fermented or sourdough or anything, it's kind of like, oh, that feels like a bit of a compromise because I like my grains to be soured and fermented when I'm using them. So I thought that this was such a neat trick to be adding sourdough discard whenever you want to thicken something with flour, because then it's already fermented and broken down and healthier that way. So that's another tip. You can also do a variety of different dinner, like casseroles or pot pie type of dishes with sourdough discard. And this comes over from one of my longtime people on YouTube that I've been a big fan of, Lisa at Farmhouse on Boone. She is the one who kind of gave me this idea. So she'll do different casseroles or bakes for dinner that'll have meat and vegetables in them, and then she'll take sourdough discard, add some eggs to it, maybe some salt, pepper, other spices, mix that together, pour that over, and then bake that in the oven. So then it comes out as a really nice one pot dinner, and is again another really easy way to use up sourdough discard. And it's great when you're wanting a quicker dinner that you don't have to wait a long time to put something together. You can just get your meat and your vegetables in there, you make your sourdough topping from your discard, pour that over, bake it, and you're done. So I thought I would share that tip in there too, because I know I've enjoyed using that as well. Some other good things that I know when you're kind of new to sourdough baking is when you're handling your dough, kind of like you saw me do there, where I poured the dough out of the bowl onto the countertop and I have some flour so that it doesn't stick, and I'm shaping my loaves and different things like that, is to get used to using minimal flour and kind of getting comfortable with a wetter dough, because the more you work at the dough and incorporate a whole bunch more flour into it while you're in the shaping stage, the tougher your baked good can be. So it's nice to not use a super dry dough. It's nice to get comfortable with how it feels to handle it, and to use your flour on the counter as minimally as you can. Have it there so that you can handle it easily, but don't go overboard. And when you're handling the dough, like I'm doing here with the flour to keep it from sticking, keep that flour on the outside. Don't work that extra outside flour into your dough as much as you can. Now, when you're getting started, it's not worth worrying about any of this, but it's just kind of some helpful tips to know. And I know that people told me this when I was first getting started with baking, and it was really helpful because it does make a difference in how your things turn out. Again, not a deal breaker. Definitely not something to even worry about in the beginning, but sometimes these tips are just helpful to hear as you're getting going, so that you can be like, oh, why is my flour on the counter disappearing when I'm working with my dough? Why do I have to keep adding so much flour? And it's probably just because you're working that flour into the dough. So if you can be mindful of that and just try to not do that, then it'll be easier. The dough will be easier to work with. The baked goods will turn out nicer, and you'll just be happier with the result. So as you get going and you've made a few recipes where you do have to shape things on the counter, that can be really helpful to just know. Another really big thing that can contribute to a learning curve when you're getting started with sourdough is figuring out those rise times. This can be really tricky in the beginning. So what I like to do is, if you've come from a background of doing a lot of yeast baking, is to take a deep breath and realize that sourdough is a lot more relaxed than yeast baking. So you know that when you have a yeasted baked good, you're really constrained by the time that you have of how long the yeast needs to develop, how long the baked good needs to rise, and then you need to bake it at exactly the right time. And it's a shorter process, but it's very timed. So a helpful thing to know about sourdough is that there is timing, but it's a lot more relaxed. So when you're first getting started, it can still be a little bit to figure out though. So one thing that I like to remember is that when you're watching for your sourdough times, it really depends a lot on the amount of sourdough starter in your recipe. And then it also, probably the biggest factor, is the temperature of the room. So another thing that can impact it a bit is the strength of your sourdough starter. But if you're using a nice, robust, active sourdough starter that you've been feeding frequently, then usually that is not as much of a hard thing to figure out. Usually it's room temperature. So while we're on the topic of feeding your sourdough starter though, if your sourdough starter, it doesn't seem to be working great, then just a little side note, you just need to feed that thing twice a day for a few days, using those measurements I talked about earlier in the video, and it'll get robust again and it should start working again just fine. Sourdough starters tend to get a little weaker if they go for long periods of time without being fed, but a really easy way to just feed your sourdough starter on a maintenance schedule is to keep it in the refrigerator and then take it out and feed it once a week. So what I do is I will take it out the night before I want to bake things. I'll feed it, I'll let it sit on the counter overnight, and then I'll use that nice, active, bubbly starter to do my baking. And then I will feed it again after I've taken out what I need for my baking and left just the right amount, not too much. And then feed that right amount, put it back in the refrigerator, and then let it sit in there for another week. So I'm not one who keeps my sourdough starter out on the counter and feeds it every day. I just find that baking once a week fits into my life a lot better. So that's what I do. But all that aside, assuming that you're working with a nice active sourdough starter, really the room temperature is the biggest thing that you need to pay attention to when you are getting your timing right for rising. So, and it'll depend on the recipe a little bit. Like for this sandwich bread loaf that you can see here, the first rise time is a bit more relaxed. And then the second time in the loaf is when you really watch to bake it at the right amount of time. The round sourdough loaves with the fancy cut designs on the top, I find that the first rise for those is the one that you have to be a little bit more careful with. If you let those rise too long in their first rise, then you'll just end up with a flat sourdough loaf. And if you watched some of my earlier videos, you saw some of those when I was still figuring out the timing. And like I said in those videos, it's okay. It's still tasty sourdough bread and we can still enjoy it. It's really fun once you get the nice high rise on those. But as you do recipes a couple times, you'll start to get the feel for it. You have to kind of adjust as you go throughout the year, because as you move into spring and summer and warmer temperatures, then those rise times are going to shorten a lot. But one trick that I have used many, many times is the refrigerator. So for example, something that I'll run into quite frequently is I have something rising. I know that I don't want it to rise all night because then that will be too long. It'll be overproofed. But I know that it's too soon to just bake it right now, or it doesn't work with my schedule to bake it. Maybe I'm about ready to go to bed and I don't want to sit there and wait for something to bake, especially when it's not risen enough. So what I'll do is I'll just stick it in the refrigerator for the night, and then I'll take it out the next morning, and if it has some more rising to do, I'll let it sit on the counter until it's finished that rise, and then I'll be able to proceed with the recipe as normal. So just keep that tip in your mind for whenever you need to slow down the rising, it's happening too fast or it's not going to fit with your schedule, so that you can, sleep when you need to instead of be up all night baking bread or whatever. Just stick it in the refrigerator. The cool temperatures slow down that activity of those beneficial microbes, and then it'll just fit into your schedule better, so you can time it with when it works for you. So make sure and check out those beginner-friendly sourdough recipes that I have linked down in the description box. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and found the tips helpful. I know that each of those tips, as I learned them, was really helpful for me. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Stick around if you like this kind of content. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!